Hear me okay?
Anthony, over to you.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for giving up your time this evening. And I've been interested in, I guess, climate change for nearly 20 years now. When I started to go to Oxford University initially to listen to some climate scientists, and I was pretty surprised by what I was hearing there. And it led to a complete change in my career and also ultimately my lifestyle. And food was always something that I was gradually picking up information about. And there is a lot of information about the environmental impacts of food. People don't seem to agree too much on what the priorities are. And the information is often conflicting and confusing. So over the last 3 or 4 years, I've spent a lot of time reading a lot of research documents, and I want to share the findings of that research with you tonight. And I think there are some quite clear messages coming out from that, which I found quite surprising, and I hope you'll find it interesting. At the very end, I'll give you a short link, which is an opportunity for you to give me a little bit of feedback, which helps me to reflect on the talk and hopefully improve it for other audiences. And in return, I'll send you an email if you would like with the slides. So, you know, if there's anything of interest or the sources and things, everything will be on those slides and I can email those to you. So if I just quickly share my screen. Hang on, I'm not sure if that worked. I'm just going to try that once more.
Anthony, that did share.
Did it? So can you see the slides?
Yes, I can see. I can see them.
Great. Okay. Well, so these are some of the questions that I hope to be able to answer during this talk, because one thing that, again, often that comes up when people talk about food is, you know, what about population? You know, there's nearly 8 billion people on the planet, and the population is expected to grow perhaps to close to 10 billion. And therefore, some people would say, well, surely that is a bigger issue, and we'll find out whether it should be possible. Also, to look in on food miles and food waste, and also some of the broader impacts of our food choices that often perhaps we don't think about, and maybe we partly because we buy the food locally in shops, but we don't necessarily have a full sight of the whole life cycle behind it. And just briefly, my background. So after I decided to change my career to hopefully to try to do something about the environmental impacts of climate change, I did an MSc in renewable energy and sustainability about 10 years ago. I've spent 4 years developing solar projects and about 5 years involved with smart charging of electric vehicles. But outside of that, I do a lot of reading and research around a broad range of sustainability topics, and I have made quite a lot of lifestyle changes, hopefully to reflect on what I'm learning and to trying to do the best I can to try to stabilize climate. So one of the first studies that I want to share with you is a really interesting one where 37 scientists in very, very broad disciplines across the globe were brought together. And the challenge that was put to them is, can we feed a healthy diet to 10 billion people and remain within planetary boundaries? And this is quite a challenge because it's not simply about greenhouse gas emissions, but also much broader environmental boundaries, things like water and other factors like that, but also providing enough food for everybody and at a greater number of people. And they started off, their summary of the current situation was that humanity is facing a huge crisis in terms of climate and also well-being. So the majority of the world's population is currently suboptimally malnourished, and it's hard to imagine how we could have created a more dysfunctional system. So this was the words of Professor Willett, who was from Harvard University, one of the experts on this, and showing that 2 billion people lacked key micronutrients, and 2 billion people were overweight or obese. So they really felt at the moment the food system wasn't fit for purpose. it was also deemed to be deeply unhealthy from the perspective that it was responsible for more deaths than alcohol, drugs, unsafe sex, and tobacco combined, all areas that perhaps there is greater interest with regards to health. And also that the food production system threatens climate stability and ecosystem resilience, and is the largest driver in environmental degradation and transgression of planetary boundaries. So again, this is really important, that there's a huge focus on fossil fuels, and clearly we know we have to phase out fossil fuels as soon as possible. However, it's not just about fossil fuels. The food system is vital, as they found within their research, and that it had huge implications that were broader than greenhouse gas emissions, but also did contribute massively to greenhouse gas emissions too. So effectively, that they felt a huge transformation was necessary, and this was the outcome of the work that they put together. So it's called the Eat Lancet Commission. There's a website if anyone wants to go away and have a look and read about it. But this is what they called the Planetary Health Diet. And they say that this diet will save 11 billion lives per year in terms of the health and other benefits that it offers. But it will feed 10 billion and keep them within planetary boundaries. And one of the things to note is it would require a 70% drop in animal and dairy produce. It's actually a much greater drop than that if you live in the US or the UK or Europe, because we consume much greater quantities. But this gives you some idea of what this sustainable, balanced and healthy plate might look like. And the sort of wedge here in blue represents all dairy and animal sourced produce that should be on a typical plate in order for us to remain within these boundaries. So they said just 6% of the food in weight should come from beef, lamb, pork, chicken, eggs and fish together. And at the moment in Europe and Asia or Central Asia, we're 4 to 5 times over that for things like red meat compared to this diet. So I think what's important is we often forget what normal looks like, because what we consider to be normal is often not what's normal globally. It's a little bit like flying. When people here often think about reducing their flying, they're unaware that we fly 5 times more or 5 times further than the average person in the world. So, if we reduce that a tiny bit, we're still going to be many times above the global average. And there is a parallel here with food too, that our starting position is much higher in terms of the environmental impacts that we're currently having. So one question that comes up is, well, would a diet like that offer the appropriate amount of protein? And Professor Mike Berners-Lee states that we need about 44 grams of protein per person per day. And at the moment, we actually get it. So this is a global average. We actually get 49 grams of protein already from plants. So we already get more protein from plants than we do from meat. And often, again, people aren't aware of this, because when we're brought up, people say you need meat for protein and you need milk for calcium. But actually, these things were not necessarily borne out in science and research. They were just things that we were told. So the other thing that sometimes come up is people say, well, hang on, what about the types of protein? Does it provide all the amino acids and everything else that you need? And there's Dr. Katz, who founded the Center for Preventative Disease at Yale University, says that the conventional wisdom has long been that animal foods provide complete protein. But however, he says that conventional wisdom is wrong. You can get it simply by eating a reasonable variety of vegetables and fruit. So one book some of you may already be familiar with, and I highly recommend it, is Professor Mike Berners-Lee's book, How Bad Are Bananas? What I would make you aware of is it's just been updated. He released a version in 2010 and he's just released a second version in 2020. and it just says the carbon footprint of nearly everything, but there's a huge amount in there about food, which is really useful and interesting. And one of the things that he does is he looks at the energy flow for food. So if you think about it, on average, we need around 2,350 calories per day per person. And to sustain us, that's a sort of number most of us would be familiar with, between 2,500 calories, that kind of amount. At the moment, globally, we eat slightly more than that, about 2,500, although there are huge regional variances. Some obviously countries eat significantly less than that, and certainly in the US, Western culture, we eat significantly more. But if we compare an average diet at the moment, global diet, versus a plant-based diet, so you then have a level of food waste. Now, again, it's if you look globally, the food waste is not huge. It's probably more significant in our country, but it's not absolutely massive. But it is an area that, you know, we should be trying to minimize, and it also gets a lot of attention. The other thing is that there are lots of losses that take place in the food system before they reach us. Losses in harvesting, transportation, storage, and again, that's adding up, you know, around about 1,000 calories per person per day of additional waste. But then there are the last thing to show you is what losses are there in the food system for animal produce. And this shows you that if a typical diet that is which has a range of, you know, meat and dairy, etc., there are nearly 9,000 calories per person per day that are consumed by the system to give each individual person 2,300. And this is really important. And if you think about it, there is a level of there's something reasonably obvious about this, which is that if you eat an animal, that animal is fed repeatedly over a period of time up until the point at which it's slaughtered, and then we eat it. And so the question then is, well, this puts it in terms of numbers to show you how inefficient that is. So now you can start to see why it could be relatively easy to feed 8 or even 10 billion people a balanced diet if you're not wasting that amount of calories in the system with, you know, dramatically lower consumption of animal produce. Okay, these photos I'm just showing you now have come from Dr. Joseph Poore, Oxford University, and this is a photo of a footprint of a livestock farm, and you can see it's been cut out of a forest, and you'll see it's not the only one. There are quite a few here on this photograph. And then if you zoom out, you can see these patches are quite high quantity all over the place. And there are millions of them. And this is in the Amazon rainforest. And again, as Dr. Joseph Poore says at University of Oxford, simply because we prefer the taste of animal protein over plant protein, the huge swathes of the Amazon rainforest is being displaced. So the land is being burnt to actually provide space for livestock to be, but it's also the land is being burnt so that crops can be grown to feed those animals. So it's responsible for 80 to 90% of deforestation in the Amazon. So 17%, or about a sixth of the Amazon rainforest, has now disappeared. And it's thought, according to Professor Nobra, who is a Mexican climate scientist, that between 20 to 25% deforestation is a point at which the rainforest will transition into a tipping point whereby it simply cannot retain enough moisture to sustain itself, and it will move. It will take quite a long time, many decades and beyond, but it will move into a terminal decline of which it cannot recover from. So it's in a very fragile state at the moment, and as I say, one of the driving forces for that is the global demand for animal produce. So something that often comes up is, well, what about soya? People often eat soya alternatives if they're not eating animal produce or animal protein. And this is some information that comes from, it's called the Food Climate Research Network, and they are part of the University of Oxford. And what they said is that 90% of soya consumed in the UK is fed to livestock animals. So again, most of the soya that's being grown abroad and shipped into the UK is actually coming in as animal feedstock, not as tofu or other produce for us to consume. Most of it is imported from South America, and at the moment, only 20 to 30% of it they know for sure is not coming from deforested lands. So the other 70 to 80% of the soy coming in, they actually don't know where it's coming from and whether or not there is deforestation taking place. Yeah, and we've already mentioned that this is again a key reason why we're seeing deforestation in Brazil. Okay. So the other really important thing to understand is land use. And this is something that's key, because often a lot of the renewable solutions we need, if you're not mining coal and gas and things out of the ground, you often need land space to generate energy, to generate food, and there's competition. You've got things that we need for our buildings. You've got land to grow food, and then you've got, we also obviously need to maintain a high level, or at least increase a high level of forestation in order to absorb CO2 emissions. And let's have a little look at the UK. So this is a study by Harvard, and it's Dr. Helen Harwat and Professor Matthew Hayek from 2019. And this is just looking at the UK. And what this pie chart shows you is nearly half, or 48% of the UK is land area is used for animal agriculture. So 35% of the UK land is used for livestock, and 13% of the UK is used for growing crops to feed the livestock. And then we've got 11% of the UK is used to grow crops that are actually fed directly to humans. You've then got 12% of the UK is woodlands, and then we've got other things like mountains. About 7% then is left for things like housing and our own human infrastructure, if you like. So again, what you can see here is, so the UK is one of the most deforested countries in Europe. We know that the increasing forested land is going to be really key in terms of absorbing more CO2 out of the atmosphere. And if you look at this graph, often people, for instance, worry about, a housing development or something like this and the impact that has on land. But I think what this should give is some real sense of proportion about, really where that land is and where this land could come from. They then went on to do a number of calculations as well. It's also worth mentioning that as well as about 60% of the UK being used for agriculture in some way, we also import food, which takes up about the area of GB abroad. And that's where, there's large parts of the Brazilian forests, etc., that are now being used to grow food for us, and obviously all places all over the world. But at the moment, we're eating way beyond our land space. We would be unable to sustain ourselves on the kind of diets we are within our own footprint. What they calculated is that if you the crops that are fed to livestock, if you converted that to feeding those crops to humans, then you actually could reforest the space that's being used for livestock. So that would nearly quadruple the amount of woodland in the UK, from about 12% to almost half. So again, it's a really powerful way to show that, and this links back to that efficiency graph that Mike Berners-Lee showed, about, you know, all of those calories have to come from somewhere to produce the animals to then produce things like cheese and milk and pork and beef and things. And they've said that the most deployable negative emissions option for the UK for greenhouse gas emissions is to restore our native forests. They then went on to do a global assessment a year later, and what they looked at is it's called the opportunity cost. So if we did follow plant-based diets and we then reforested that land, what impact could that have on greenhouse gas emissions? Now, and just to give you an idea, global human greenhouse gas emissions are around 40 to 50 billion tons a year. Okay, so let's say 45 billion tons a year. What they've said is between now and 2050, if we changed our diets, that those forests that you could plant instead could draw down between 330 and 550 billion tons of CO2. So that's about 10-12 times the annual current greenhouse gas emissions of human beings. It's an absolutely enormous amount. At the moment, to keep temperatures stabilized at around about 1.5 degrees, we've got about 50 tons of CO2 left per person that we could consume before we need to stop completely. Doing something like this would double that allowance, if you like, and provide us huge, much greater options for how we decarbonize. The World Wildlife Fund published a report called the Living Planet Report, and in 2020 they gave an update and said that there are so many species on the planet. There is not accurate data for every single one, but there are many thousands of species that are monitored quite carefully. It is a minority in terms of the total numbers, but it gives an idea. So there are thousands of studies they look at, and on average for the populations of wildlife that are studied, the population sizes in my lifetime almost, so since 1970, have fallen by about 68%. And again, there is a recognition here that intensive agriculture, deforestation, and the conversion of wild spaces into farmland is one of the major causes of this. And that's also includes marine environment as well as on land. So again, I think probably many of us are aware of that. If you deforest, because we keep pushing the boundaries, because we do want to eat more animal produce and we keep pushing outwards as we grow and we want more of this, that obviously that has an impact. We're just pushing wildlife increasingly into the margins. And this is an interesting study. It's just a very quick graphic from people called Yinan Baran and co, called Biomass Distribution of the Earth. And what they estimated is that livestock animals by weight, so if you were to weigh all of the livestock mammals in the world, now outnumber wild mammals 15 to 1. So again, it just gives you an idea that we often have no perspective for the food system. We can't see it. We buy what we see in the shop, but what we cannot get our head around necessarily is the scale and the impact that goes on globally. And as I say, for wild animals now to be outnumbered 15 to 1 is incredible. And again, here you see the proportions. Even wild birds are pretty tiny now in comparison. And I think the other thing is, to just now to look specifically at greenhouse gas emissions. So we've looked at things like the energy input, we've looked at the land use. So what about greenhouse gas emissions? Well, we know we have to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and we know that each year we delay and the emissions keep rising. The steepness that we then need to follow to get to a stable level under 1.5 or even 2 degrees warming from pre-industrial levels gets harder and harder each year. And that this is illustrated. It was in a presentation by, again, Professor Mike Berners-Lee. And what he said is that despite, all of the wind turbines, all of the solar panels, and, there are lots of very positive things that are happening, energy efficiency, that at the moment, there's not one jot of a detectable response of a global level to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And as he says, to be clear, 2 degrees temperature warming is a level that will be difficult to live with and could bring about catastrophic tipping points. So it is really important. And and that's why I've ended up taking a very broad look at my lifestyle choices, because we're effectively already overdrawn when it comes to CO2 emissions. We're going to have to, once we've stopped emitting, which I'm sure we will at some point this century, we then have to start drawing emissions out of the atmosphere, which is going to be a lot harder and more expensive than if we try to avoid putting those emissions there in the first place. So anyway, there is obviously a lot of urgency for us to try to take changes as quickly as possible so that we can stop emitting personally and collectively. Now, food is responsible for about 26% of greenhouse gas emissions. To give you an idea, all transport, all the fuel that goes into planes, cars, shipping is responsible for about 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So food is a big sector, and after the power system, probably the second most important. So this is, if we then look at Europe, this is a profile of the greenhouse gas emissions by country in Europe. So every line you see on the screen is a different country in Europe, and it shows you the proportion of where their food greenhouse gas emissions come from. And what this tells us is everything you see in red and orange, which takes you about 80% or over 80% of the way there, comes from dairy and meat and eggs. So 83% of greenhouse gas emissions from our food in Europe comes from animal produce. And I believe it's the bar in blue is fruit and vegetables, just to give you an idea, again, of the scale and of the difference. And this flag indicates where the UK stands, by the way, which is probably, fairly similar to everybody else. So again, what you can see now globally, of greenhouse gas emissions for food, about 58% of those emissions come from animal produce, but in Europe it's 83%, and that's because we simply eat more. And the other thing to mention is that livestock alone is on track to consume half of our remaining carbon budget by just 2030 for 1.5 degrees warming. And at the moment, there's every chance that food will be by far the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, because at least there is a greater recognition that we should be transitioning from fossil fuels to renewable energy. We don't yet have that same recognition for a transition to plant-based food system. This is just a graphic from there's a lot of the research that I've mentioned today are really well summarized on an Oxford University website called Our World in Data. So it's something I'd recommend if you're interested. They've got lots and lots of information and they summarize it really well. And this is one of the graphs they pulled out. And what this just shows you is the emissions for 100 grams of protein, the greenhouse gas emissions, and in order. The reason you've got these wiggly lines is because it depends, there are variations depending on where it comes from in the world and exactly the processes involved. But what you can see, you've got at higher end, you've got beef, lamb, shrimp, cheese, pork, chicken, eggs. But the plant-based options such as tofu, beans, peas, they're dramatically lower than the options up here, and usually the highest plant-based option is significantly lower than the lowest of the animal produce. I don't know if any of you've had an opportunity to try plant-based burgers. Vegetarian burgers used to be rubbish. There's been a massive amount of innovation in this space. So for anyone who thinks they would really struggle to miss burgers, there are now a number of different burger brands out there that are plant-based that you would probably not even know are not meat-based. That's how much they've progressed. Things like Beyond Meat. There was a company called Miami Burger who was set up in Reading originally, and they now supply many retail. And they're still doing the numbers and the analysis in terms of the precise greenhouse gas emissions as a comparison. But the UK Government Climate Change Committee estimates that beef burgers may be 25 times more or higher greenhouse gas emissions than a plant-based burger. But even if it's 20 or 15 times, it's still going to be a dramatic difference and a completely different order of magnitude. And when you think that many, I mean, I have people who really say they would miss burgers, and I've got them to try some of these alternatives. They've said they've been really surprised that actually I cannot taste the difference anymore. So again, it's worth trying those things. If I'm not necessarily saying that processed food is the healthiest thing to eat in the world wherever it comes from. But in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions, the difference is stark. Organic food people often ask about, and I'm not going to go into it in much detail. What I would say is if you go to Our World in Data, they've got a really good article called "Is Organic Agriculture Better for the Environment?" Now, clearly, there are some benefits in terms of things like the chemicals and some other factors of that order. But actually, it's not that simple. So you've already seen the land pressures that we have. The fact that animal agriculture uses nearly 50% of the UK. If everyone switched to organic food, that would create more deforestation initially because it simply would need more land. And this is what this graph will show without going into too much detail, but broadly, if you switch to organic foods, you are likely to be then using more land, for example. So the big message is, the big difference is removing animal produce. Then you might create some space for perhaps organic fruits and vegetables. But if you're continuing to eat meat and animal produce, then organic is probably not going to be particularly helpful. So another interesting comparison is things like the dairy milk versus alternative milks. And I know, again, there's often stories in the press about whether the alternatives are actually just as bad or worse. So again, this is from the University of Oxford, and you can see you've got dairy, rice, soy, oat, and almond milk compared. The top, this bar in red here is the greenhouse gas emissions for 200 millilitres. And you can see that dairy is obviously the highest. You've got milk, rice milk is probably about 30 to 40%. And then you've got soy, oat, and almond at the lower end. Then you've got the land use. And again, you can see all four of them use dramatically less land. And then water use. So this is something that sometimes comes up with almond milk, that it's more water intensive, which is true. You can still see that it consumes less water than dairy milk. But it's for this reason that I tend to drink primarily oat milk and sometimes soy milk, because I think that offers the best balance across all of these environmental factors. and is not going to have the same impact in things like water use as almond might do. And then just one other thing that comes up a lot is food miles, and often environmental community groups talk about, food miles quite a bit, and the importance of eating local food, and certainly eating things like seasonal fruits and vegetables is a great idea, and locally. But let's again look at the global system and put this in perspective. So this probably isn't the easiest graph to see, but you've got the bars here now indicate where the emissions are in the system. So we're looking at greenhouse gas emissions for different types of food. So beef happens to be the top one. And then the colours tell you where the emissions come from. So we've got land use change in green, you've got emissions on the farm in brown. In red, which is a tiny little bar here, is the transport emissions for beef. And if you look at all of the foods, you can barely see the red line for transport. So just to put it in perspective, about 6 or 7% of the emissions, CO2 emissions from food, come from transport. The only exception that we need to be aware of is avoiding air freighted foods. Now, globally, only 1 in 600 tons of food is air freighted because it's really expensive. However, it will be higher in the UK and other wealthier countries that can afford it at times. But effectively, if you're buying a highly perishable food like berries out of season from the other side of the world, there is a good chance they may well have been air freighted. But one thing we need to ask of our politicians is we need food to be labeled to tell us if it's been air freighted, and tell us what the emissions and impacts are. So this is one thing that we certainly should be talking to our MPs about, because the frustrating thing is you often cannot tell, and then you have to apply your common sense. Now, people often say, well, avocados are flown, and they're not. They tend to come by ship, and things that have got a reasonably robust cover, like an orange or a banana, these things all come by ship, so they're actually very low emission. I mean, I've already mentioned How Bad Are Bananas by Mike Berners-Lee, which is a fantastic book. There's another book that's just out by Professor Sarah Bridle at Manchester University, and she's written this brilliant book called Food and Climate Change Without the Hot Air. Some of you may have heard of David Mackay, who was chief scientist for the UK government, and he wrote a book called Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air. And she knew him and she was inspired by him. And so she's written this same sort of book, but it's all focused around helping people to understand what choices they can make with. And what's brilliant is she does it by types of meals and shows you all sorts of different meals and then what makes the emissions up. You can get it free as an ebook. So if you go, I think it's sarahbridle.com. You can download it for free on your Kindle or any other sort of viewer, book viewer, and absolutely fascinating. I'll give you a couple of examples. These are curries. So you've got here on the left hand side, you've got a lamb tikka masala, and the CO2 emissions are just over 6 kilograms, and you can see the different makeup. So you've got butter and onion and garlic. Obviously, the lion's share of it is coming from the lamb itself. And then she also includes emissions for our cooking, things like frying and simmering, and explains to us, again, little things like, if you have an oven for one person on for an hour, you're going to also use more emissions, the cooking process, than if you were to either stockpile and put several meals in the oven and then microwave them on other days, or at least to fit more food for more people in at one go. So that's over 6 kilograms for a lamb tikka masala. It's about 9 times less for a corn tikka masala, and about 10 times less for a chickpea tikka masala. So this just gives you an idea of how she lays it out. And this is a typical breakfast. So again, what's interesting here is it also it shows you how a latte can have really significant emissions. So she's saying that we should be trying to get to less than 3 kilograms of CO2 a day. So a latte would use nearly half of that. One latte would use nearly half of that allowance. And primarily it's because of the milk in the latte rather than the coffee. And there again, you've got a difference between a cheese sandwich at 900 grams versus a peanut butter sandwich that's 175. So again, loads and loads of examples, and she explains it really well, and she links all the research. So it's a really great book, and it's sarahbridle.net. So fish. This is something, again, that many people opt for because they're aware of things like the greenhouse gas emissions with beef and pork and lamb, for example, and many people have opted to eat more fish. So let's just have a quick look at one or two things here. So first thing, and this really surprised me, more than half the fish now that we eat, it is not from traditional fishing. Or from open water fishing. It's now from intensively farmed fish. And so you can see the blue line at the bottom is intensively farmed fish, and the red line is sort of more traditional fisheries. So you can see overall that fishing is growing, so demand for fishing is growing, but particularly these concentrated intensive farms. And in fact, in Scotland, they have a huge number of these, and there are challenges with this. So one thing is that often environmental groups are equally worried about plastics, and particularly plastics in the ocean. Now, more than half of the large pieces of plastic in the ocean come from the fishing industry. So it's a huge source of plastic pollution. And obviously, if you imagine damaged nets being disposed of in the ocean, you can imagine how much damage that can do to sea life, who obviously will get caught up in it. The second thing is that Dr. Joseph Porce said that factory farm fish often now produces more methane than beef, and you'll probably know that methane is much more powerful greenhouse gas emission than carbon dioxide. So if you imagine these intensively farmed fish, they produce a lot of feces, and that sinks to the bottom. And if it decomposes in the absence of oxygen, instead you get methane, which then is released at the surface. So again, it can be very, very high emission. And again, to give you an idea in how many intensive farms there now are in Scotland, the fish, intensively farmed fish, produce 3 times as much poo as the several million population of Scotland. So if you imagine the local environmental impacts that has when it's going into waterways and the coast, and the impacts it has on other fish life and in that area. So this is just summarizes the study by Paul and Nemecek, the University of Oxford. And so globally, they mention that animal produce provides 18% of calories, but it uses 83% of land, and it uses 58% of the greenhouse gas emissions from food. So to put that in perspective, that means that the calories we get from animal use require nearly 20 times as much land as the calories we get from non-animal produce. Another question that then comes up is, okay, well, what if we did all follow a plant-based diet? What might that look like in terms of the benefits? And so again, the study looked at various aspects, but ocean dead zones is one issue that we're starting to see. It's called eutrophication, where you get excess nutrients coming off animal agriculture leaking into waterways, and then algae consumes those nutrients and they draw the oxygen out of the water, and then they become dead zones for fish. And in fact, also in the UK, I think only 14% of our rivers are deemed to be of good quality, and this is one of the primary reasons why that there's all of the animal agricultural nutrients are coming into the waterways, and we're seeing a very similar effect. So we would reduce the amount of eutrophication by 40% if everyone followed a plant-based diet. We would use 75% less land for agriculture. So that is an area bigger than United States, China, and most of Western Europe. We're talking an astonishing amount of land that could be put to alternative uses, primarily reforestation and allowing natural ecosystems to restore, but also for other things like solar and other positive technologies. The other thing that people often say is, well, don't animals often consume calories from marginal lands that humans couldn't grow crops to eat? And whilst there's, in some cases, that's the case, what their study discovered is that though we're not taking any calories now from the animal system, the amount of crops we would need to grow would actually reduce by 20%. And that's because of that sheer amount of crops we were using to feed animals repeatedly. So we don't need more cropland because we're all eating plant-based diets. We would need significantly less land, cropland. And this just gives an idea of the land difference if everyone followed a plant-based diet. So it's bigger than the size of Africa is land that we could recover, and certainly it's then going to remove that pressure to deforest, which is such a major concern at the moment. So it's estimated that we would see over 2 tons of CO2 saved per person per year on a plant-based diet. But what's been estimated is that about half of that comes from the food you eat, that reduction, and the other half is this opportunity cost, which is that by changing your diet, if that land was then used to reforest and to draw down CO2, that would then double up another ton. At a country level, we've seen very little, actually. And interestingly, the country that's had the most interesting discussion about changing diet is China, where there are discussions happening about setting a target to reduce animal consumption by 50%, which is incredible, because we're not seeing any targets really set anywhere else. Now, one thing that was interesting in Canada is that you probably see periodically that countries produce these healthy eating guidelines, and most of them have meat and dairy and things like that on there. Now, Canada, for the first time, when they produced the guidelines recently, they took all the industry lobbyists out, and they just used researchers and academics and impartial experts to assess it. And when they did that, they actually removed dairy as one of the necessary food groups from that. So you can see that clearly that pressure from lobbying does play a major part in the food industry, not only to retain it, but even to do the reverse, which is to provide subsidies for eating animal produce. In the UK, the Climate Change Committee produces regular reports to hold the UK government to account on reducing emissions. And whilst they're quite strong on things like energy and transport, they kind of shied away from food. I think people are very worried to talk about it. And that's partly why I was motivated to try to put this talk together, to share this research, because I think they're nervous about maybe the headlines it might create and that people aren't ready for it. But effectively what they said is they weren't talking about setting targets. They just felt that meat production might reduce by 20% in the UK just by itself, by people choosing to make that change. I think that's not very ambitious at all. I would have thought they could achieve a 20% reduction much faster than that, in several years rather than 30 years, which again, it would make a very, very big impact. I'm not going to talk too much about animal sentience. That's obviously another factor, which is why some people choose to shift their diets. What I would say is I'd recommend a book by Professor Francione, who was the first law professor in the US of animal rights. And he writes it's a really short book. You could read it in little more than an hour, I would say, called Eat Like You Care. And it's really, really interesting, just helping you to think again about the ethics of consuming animal produce and thinking about it quite carefully. There's also been some interesting films, one recently, which would give a bit of an indication of the animal industry in a similar environment to our own, called Dominion. So it's a free documentary, or you can just go and have a look at the trailer. But we know that around 70 to 80 billion animals do lose their life each year to this system, and up to in the region of 1 trillion fish. And again, people don't think that actually fish do feel pain, and they are sentient, and they are all capable of suffering. Some people are, if they are thinking about transitioning or in this direction, there's a fantastic resource about the health impacts. It's hundreds of NHS medical professionals are members of the Plant-Based Health Professionals UK, and they have fantastic fact sheets about, is it safe to eat a plant-based when you're pregnant or for young children, and it talks about all range of conditions that people have with advice on it. So they have loads of great resources. They also do courses. So I would recommend Plant-Based Health Professionals if you're thinking about this. The other thing is I take a supplement, which is just one of these tablets each day, which are quite cheap, from the Vegan Society, and they just supplement one or two things, some of which people are insufficient on a general diet, and some of them are specific to a plant-based diet. Now, some people say, well, why would I want to do that when I could get these naturally from animal produce? Well, often some of these things that you get from animals, the animals don't produce either. The animals are fed supplements. So question is it easier to eat one of these tablets every day, or would you want it fed to an animal and then you eat the animal to eat a supplement? You see, it's not a particularly efficient way of doing it. But it is important not to forget this. If you did decide to transition to a full plant-based diet, there are one or two key things, and these are important to maintain good health. And then again, there's the film The Game Changers, which talks about the fact that a lot of elite sports people have now transitioned to plant-based diets, including Venus Williams, Lewis Hamilton, Chris Froome, Novak Djokovic, David Hay. I even understand Messi, the footballer, for the majority of this, when he's playing during the season, he follows a plant-based diet. There's also a good fact check of the film by Dr. Carvalho on YouTube. So again, that's worth watching. And broadly, he thinks the science is very strong. There's a couple of, he said, less important examples in the film that are worth mentioning, but broadly, the core of the film stands up to the science. And then yeah, I mean, there are plenty of resources out there. And again, if you wouldn't mind just filling in the brief questionnaire link that I give you, that would be great. And then I can send you this with all the links in, but you can track if you just want to check with any diet change, you can track your nutrients by putting foods into one or two free apps. And then you can just check and say, yep, this looks like I've got the hang of it and I've got the right kind of things covered. And again, there's another good website called Nutrition Facts as well. It's good podcasts. And Happy Cow is an app that we use to help find places, cafes and restaurants that have vegan food. So the key messages are that food emissions in the UK are about 50% above the global average, around about 3 versus 2 tons. We need to get that below 1 ton. So in the UK, we've got to cut our food emissions by about 2/3. To give a rough idea, a vegetarian diet will halve your footprint roughly, and going to a full vegan diet will reduce it by about 70%. But then there are still things you can then do at that point that can make it better or worse in terms of, if you're using air freight, and food waste. So, reducing food waste is always going to help, and avoiding air freight, again, that can reduce your food emissions by around about 20% if you can eliminate those. Not easy to do, as we said, without food labeling to tell us about that. And Dr. Joseph Port, again, his reports are available. He's got some good talks as well on YouTube, but he said for a typical average consumer, diet change isn't just the single biggest way to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions, but your land use, your impact on biodiversity, nitrogen, phosphorus pollution, acid rain, water use, and probably pesticide and antibiotic use, although they didn't actually measure the last two that he mentions there. And this is the link. So that's the end of the talk. So the link is tinyurl.com/AS Food Talk, which I could pop in the chat briefly. And if you're happy just to fill in a very quick survey, which will take you less than 60 seconds, I will. You can click a box in there for me to email you the slides. And also, if you have any questions that come up as a result, please let me know. And I've got a very basic website called Every Big Helps, which does have some other things as well. Things like I do talks on environmental impacts of electric cars. Anyway, thank you. I think that's probably a bit too long, so I will stop there. Thank you, Michael.
Anthony, does any of our guests have any questions? We'll probably overwork. Anthony, do you want to pop the link in the chat, please?
Yeah, sure. One moment.
Thank you, Jamie and Michelle. I don't know if you can see them, Anthony, but there was a lot to take in.
Sorry, I'll probably try and squeeze in a bit too much. Oh, hang on, I think I've got to put that to everybody.
Jamie's asked a question here. Do you see a place for Knepp style? He means the Knepp estate over in Kent, I think it is, in style wild range meat. Obviously, it would be very, very expensive, but will give choice.
Sorry, what kind of, is this the sort of lab meat, if you like?
No, what the Knepp? I think Jamie means the Knepp estate. Wild range meats, right? Livestock running wild, I think would be.
Yeah. I don't know, actually. It's not something I've looked at, and I don't know if you've got a link, Jamie. If you could pop it in, and I can go away and have a little look at it, if you like. I'm not sure. Does that mean sort of eating up wild animals or something like that?
Or livestock just allowed to graze more naturally as well, my understanding as well.
Yeah, I mean the thing with livestock growing more naturally is back to this issue of land use. So you've seen the global 83% of the food system globally is area of land is used for animal produce, and also then you have to bear in mind that most of that is intensively farmed, which is pretty frightening as well. So if you then want to start consuming meat that has more space, then you're simply going to use more land. You're going to, and at the moment, that means deforestation, because we're already deforesting at the levels we are. I mean, I'm not saying, I probably don't want to get too much into the ethics of, whether that's better for the animals or not, but that's why I choose not to eat them at all, because then you know, that I know as well, and that you'll see the emission saving. I don't think it will help in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So yeah. So are there any other questions?
And Kay's asked on milk alternatives, any idea where coconut milk features in terms of water use impact, as that's what she uses?
Good question, Kate. I don't know, in all honesty. So if you're able to fill in the survey and you make a note of that in the notes at the end, I will see if I can find out and let you know. I don't know off the top of my head. Quickly, I've got a couple of books here, so I might be able to look it up while we're here.
Francis has put in about NEP estate is more about preserving the variety of species.
Oh, okay.
Because they've done a lot. I know they've done a lot of rewilding there. My understanding.
Yeah, I'll need to look that coconut one up anyway, but yeah.
Anthony, I'll ask a question. Recently seen flagged up that eating apples that are in season from overseas is less impact than eating our apples out of season that have been stored in chilled and gas controlled storage facilities. Do you have any view on that, or is that something else to look at?
My feeling is that, so one thing that which I didn't mention where it comes to berries is often things like the winter, it is actually a good thing to eat frozen berries, because those will not have been flown. So they by freezing them and sending them, whilst that does use more emissions, it's still negligible compared to air freight. So I suspect that eating apples, whether they're stored here or imported, I don't think I think in both cases they will be low carbon, and they will be perfectly okay to eat from that perspective.
Thank you. And Jamie's asked, is CAP reform necessary in your view? The CAP's gone anyway, hasn't it? Or is going, I should say going, isn't it? It's going to be replaced with this environmental land management scheme.
Yeah, it's 100%. It needs reforming, and I think somebody sent me a link the other day, which I've not yet read, that said that 90% of the subsidies from the EU are actually detrimental to the environment, and the common agricultural policy is a classic example where you're obviously subsidizing animal produce and you're making it cheaper. It's even worse in the US, where pretty much it is cheaper to feed yourself with burgers from McDonald's than it is to go and buy fresh fruit and vegetables. And that's because one's heavily subsidized, the one that's really bad for you and the environment, and the one that's really good and healthy for you is not subsidized. So yeah, it totally needs reforming. And then I see a note from Michelle about how do we counter the lobbyists. Well, my feeling is that food is a really good example of something where the politicians are very nervous about negative publicity, about the tabloids saying that we're going to take their burgers and sausages away, or whatever it happens to be. And that's why I simply want to try to get the information out there about the emissions, the land use, the deforestation, and the implications of it are absolutely enormous. And therefore I feel there's an important grassroots role, because a few years ago when I decided to go plant-based. I didn't know anyone else that was plant-based, and that makes it hard. And it also means that when you're talking about it, you're completely in the minority. But I think that's changing. I understand that it's increased by about 40% in the last year, the number of people following plant-based diet, and particularly in younger age groups. So I'm hoping and hopeful that we're getting closer to a tipping point in attitudes. And once there are lots of people doing it, we then see the politicians will then start to be more open to it. But I actually feel it's more likely to be led by consumers and the general public rather than by politics. I just think it's too sensitive for them. But you look at the numbers, you look at the data. I think all they have to do is put this research into the public domain. They don't even have to express an opinion. If you put the information out there, people will go, wow, this is insane. Doesn't, I was brought up to eat, to eat meat, to eat dairy because it's a balanced diet. It would, but simply like anything else, lobbying has played a really big part in that. And we've got to get this information out. It's all done. The research is there. There's loads of it from academics and people who don't have an axe to grind. And these people need to be talking to politicians. I was sent, there's a Westminster event coming up on food and agriculture and environmental impacts. And I couldn't see any of these experts that I've been reading about there. And I emailed them and I could see that they had people like the National Farmers Union and other farming sort of members. And when I saw the NFU present at the Citizens Climate Assembly, there was no research there. They just said, UK beef is the greenest in the world, eat British meat. And it's I shouldn't swear, but it's completely misleading. It's completely wrong. And it's outrageous that they're allowed to do that they're unchallenged, and that yet they don't allow the people who have spent years researching this and all coming up with very similar themes in terms of the impacts, why that information is not being very, very clearly communicated. So anyway, hopefully that's why I'm going to try, and if you know other places I could give this talk, I try to do about 10-15 talks a year, and I'm always interested to talk to new audiences, so please let me know if that's of interest.
And I think time's getting on. We'll take the last question from Helen. You see that, Anthony, about the Mac Plant burgers being trialled by McDonald's. Does that tell us we are already at a tipping point?
It's coming. It's coming, and often you see, if there are a group of 10 people go out for dinner, it only often takes one person who follows a plant-based diet to then determine where they end up going to eat. And so I think that's why you've got loads of people now with vegan options, but now there are more places that now have a full vegan menu. And I'd be slightly cynical and say that it's probably more of a business decision, but it's very encouraging sign, isn't it? It means they can see the trends, they can see the growth in this, and yeah, I am very confident we're going to see a huge transition probably this decade with food. What I'm encouraging people to do is have some really high quality conversations about it based on the evidence and research, and to try to do it as quickly as possible, because every year of delay is more emissions in the air, is more of the Amazon deforested, and all the other impacts that we will have to somehow try to repair later.
Thank you very much, Anthony. That's been a lot of information to take in, but
sorry, hope it wasn't too much.
But so thank you for that, and thank you to our guests this evening for joining us.